The stars went out. Not all at once, and not every single one, but a significant number in a strip about 40 degrees wide at the outer edge of the observation zone. Kepler, the furthest telescope at the border stations, registered the changes simultaneously. Duty officers at 3 different stations filed 3 different reports within 60 seconds of one another. The reports differed in their wording. They were identical in their bewilderment. What was out there? Something massive. Something that blocked the light. The first ship crossed the threshold of FTL transition at 3:47 station time, then another, then 5 more, then 20. The sensors at Kepler Bravo stopped counting at 39 and quietly began to reboot, because 39 vessels of such mass crossing explored space simultaneously was something the sensors were not programmed to expect. By 4, there were 47. Each was the size of a city that had decided to grow upward until it ran out of ideas. They moved in a pattern not random, not tactical, but intentional, like a sentence written across a dark field. A pattern that meant something. 7 different xenolinguists at 7 different stations simultaneously identified the pattern, and all 7 sent the same message up the chain. It spelled a word in 11 dead languages, languages of species so ancient their names had become archaeology. Every time it translated the same, the inevitable. That is what they called themselves. No one slept at Heck Command that night. Arifal stood on the forward observation deck of the Throne of First Light and stared at the small yellow star ahead, feeling only patience. He had experienced this moment 47 times. Not this specific moment, not this specific star, not this specific configuration of approaching minor worlds, but its shape, its specific weight, the way the silence before revelation pressed against the hull of the ship like water pressing against the skin of a swimmer. He was tall, even by Vaelian standards, a 7-limbed being, as were all his kin. 4 legs set in a wide, stable arc, 3 arms positioned on the upper body, the 2 outer ones longer, the central one shorter and more precise. His skin shifted color when he was in deep thought, shimmering in blue and gold hues for which there was no precise name in the human language, though the closest words might be cathedral and ember. His face had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line. The 2 outer ones were for distance, the 2 inner ones for reading the faces of those he spoke to. He had spent 70 years honing his speech. Not the words were ancient, recorded by the first consequence 12 generations ago. What he honed was the delivery, the timing of every pause, the precise frequency modulation that made the voice resonate inside the listener's chest before their brain could process a single syllable. He had learned early on, at the dawn of his service, that faith is not a thought, it is a sensation. You did not convince a species to believe. You made belief feel as though it were already happening to their body. And then, you gave that sensation a name. The name was always the same. The Vael, the first created, the bringers of light, the architects of all that lives. He looked at the yellow star. A small thing. A warm and ordinary star that birthed life in a damp, fragile, carbon-based form. A star that birthed beings who feared the dark. Such were the easiest. He straightened his 3 arms. He thought of the 11 species who now contributed to the Dominion, their labor, their resources, their sincere and voluntary worship, given freely because they understood, as all sentient beings eventually do, that being part of something eternal is better than being alone in a universe that does not care about your existence. He was not a cruel being. He was not, by his own honest estimation, even a dishonest one. He believed, as a man who has never been questioned believes, that the Vael were exactly what they claimed to be. The evidence had been around him for 4,000 years, 11 species, a dominion stretching across a quarter of the explored galaxy. How else to call it if not divine? He nodded to his signal officer. The broadcast began. Duty Officer Prionaire was drinking her 3rd coffee of the shift when the signal hit every frequency simultaneously. It was not a standard broadcast. It did not originate from a specific, directed source. It originated from the space between the 47 ships, as if the ships themselves were merely speakers and something else was the voice. It struck the station's electromagnetic receivers, its quantum entanglement relays, its backup analog systems. And Nair would swear in her report. She felt it hit something inside her chest that was not a receiver at all. She sat very still for 8 seconds. The voice was huge, not loud huge, but huge in the way a mountain is not loud. yet still too big to look at all at once. It spoke at a frequency that made her teeth ache, and the muscles along her spine do things they had never done before they tried to stand without being asked. She gripped the edge of the console. The words, once the translation software caught up, were, "We are the Vael. We are the first created. Before your sun ignited, we burned. Before your world formed, we built. You have been alone in your confusion for long enough. We have come to end your confusion. We are your creators. We are your destiny. Now you may find peace, because you are known." The voice went silent. Nair realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled. She opened the response protocol terminal. She looked at the 47 ships on her screen, each obscuring the stars behind it. Each so massive that her brain kept trying to reclassify them as geological objects, not ships. She opened the SIMS form. Unidentified entity, first contact protocol, request for biological and technological classification. She filled in everything she could based on sensor data, leaving the rest blank. She attached the request to the unidentified entities with a request for missing information at their earliest convenience. She sent it. She picked up her coffee. She looked at her colleague across the station, a young man named Betts, who had been sitting with his mouth open for the last 4 minutes. "Send that up the chain," she said, "and tell the kitchen we're going to need more coffee." The SIMS form arrived on the throne of First Light 11 minutes after the broadcast. It arrived like a pebble dropped at the feet of a man expecting a crown. Arafal's signal officer handed him the translation with the cautious face of a man reporting news he wasn't sure how to survive. He read it. He read it again. The document requested the Vael's assumed biological classification, their technological development index on the HEC standard scale, the names and functions of the fleet ships, the identity and authority level of the commanding subject, and the coordinates of their home system for the purpose of the... He paused here. Surely the translation was wrong, the diplomatic registry. At the bottom was a small, automated postscript. "Thank you for establishing contact with the Expeditionary Human Forces. A representative will be in touch within 72 standard hours. If the contact is of an emergency nature, please indicate in the contact urgency field. Field 7C2, page 2. Arafal set the document down. He stood by the window for a long time. Outside, the yellow star burned. It burned as it always had, unaware of the significance of this moment. His generals were waiting for him to speak. His followers were waiting. The entire bridge froze in the kind of silence that rooms fall into when the person everyone is looking at does something no one can interpret. He thought of the 11 species. He thought of how each of them had reacted to the revelation, some with tears, some with immediate prostration, some with an air of complete numbness that looked like shock but was, in fact, a physiological reaction to awe. None of them had sent a form. He said, not addressing anyone in particular, "Send a follow-up broadcast." His signal officer blinked. The full revelation again. The high follower? No. He paused. Something shorter. Remind them who we are. What he felt, standing there looking at the translated SIMS form, he didn't have a word for. His language was ancient and extremely precise in describing states of divine experience. He had 17 words for different shades of light. He had 9 words for specific sensations of worship. He had no word for what was currently happening in his chest. He filed it under confusion. He was wrong about what it was. He would continue to be wrong. Admiral Saravens was eating a sandwich when her link opened. Turkey, mustard. The bread was slightly stale because the kitchen of the Unconquerable Union had been running on reduced supplies for 6 weeks, waiting for a supply shipment that logistics promised to resolve and hadn't. She had stopped waiting for logistics to solve problems on time about 15 years ago and had come to terms with slightly stale bread, the way one comes to terms with things that are annoying but not worth dying over. "Admiral," the voice of her communications officer said, "Command wants you on the priority channel." It's about the contacts in the Kepler zone." She took another bite of her sandwich. She opened her personal terminal with her free hand and looked at the preliminary sensor data that had been in her queue for the last 40 minutes. She looked at the count, looked at the mass readings, looked at the translation of the word the fleet formation had written across the dark field. The inevitable. She had been on expedition for 31 years. She had made contact with 6 species. 2 of them were friendly. 1 was indifferent. 3 had tried to kill her in ways ranging from standard to deeply creative. None of them had started with a word meaning inevitable. She looked at the transcript of the broadcast that Kepler had already sent up. She read the words about them being the first created and the architects of all living things. She read them as she read everything, directly, without expression, as if reading an inventory list. She set the transcript aside. "Connect me with Kepler Bravo," she said. "Yes, Admiral." She finished her sandwich. Ensign de Adeyemi had served on the unconquerable Union for 11 weeks. He was 23 years old and had graduated third in his class from the HEC Academy. That meant he was very good at doing things conducted in controlled environments. Space, he had discovered, was not a controlled environment. Space was controlled environments floating inside something that had no interest in control. He was at his observation post on the bridge's secondary deck when the cascading alarm went off. First yellow, then amber, then the red that meant everyone stopped doing what they were doing. He watched the incoming data, count, mass, the translation of the broadcast. He was from Lagos, originally a city of 20 million people, which, in his experience, had very little ability to surprise him. He had seen things in Lagos that would make a seasoned soldier hold his breath. He did not consider himself easily frightened. He was scared not in a theatrical sense, not with shaking hands or gray vision at the edges, but in a quiet sense. In the sense where his body continued to function normally while some part of his brain, responsible for honest assessment, looked at the numbers on the screen and started making calculations that led to a very bad result. 47 ships. He checked the mass readings again, then checked the units, because of course there was an error, each with a mass greater than Earth's moon. He made the calculations. He turned away from the screen and looked at the other crew members around him, junior officers. Most of them, some his age, some younger. They were all looking at their screens with the same expression, an expression of people making calculations and getting the same answer as he did. Then news came from the command deck. Admiral Vance had taken the situation under her consideration. Admiral Vance had reviewed the broadcast, the sensor data, and the response from Kepler Bravo via the Sims form. Admiral Vance had said, "Uh-huh," and returned to what she was doing. Adeyemi looked at the 47 ship contacts on his screen. He looked at the section of the board showing the Union's current status. 1 ship. A mid-class hull. 22 weapons systems, of which 19 were in working order because 3 were waiting for the same supply delay that made the bread stale. He didn't make those calculations. He very consciously chose not to make those calculations. Arafal sent a second broadcast. It was, as he had ordered, shorter. It contained a demonstration. The Vael did not threaten. Threats were the language of equals, and there were no equals here. Instead, they demonstrated with the vessel of sacred proofs, a mid-fleet ship whose only purpose was this specific function, to move into position beside a small, uninhabited moon on the outer edge of the system. The moon was approximately 700 meters in diameter. It had no atmosphere, no liquid water, no life confirmed by the Vael's own scans, because they were thorough, because they did not want to accidentally destroy something that mattered. The vessel of sacred proofs activated its compression array. The moon collapsed inward in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It didn't explode, didn't shatter into pieces. It collapsed, compressed into an ideal geometric sphere about 1/4 of its original size. Its surface was smooth and mirror-bright, slowly rotating on the orbital plane. It was beautiful. In the cold sense, in the way absolute power is sometimes beautiful. Arafal watched it and again felt the deep professional satisfaction of a man who does his job very well. He saw how this demonstration converted 3 species in one broadcast. The Terrets began their first prayers before the compression was even complete. He waited. The HEC response came 40 minutes later. It was from Dr. Ilya Hoffman of the University of New Geneva, Department of Astrophysics and Planetary Sciences. Dr. Hoffman expressed in formal and enthusiastic terms that the compression demonstration was a remarkable and unprecedented application of gravitational engineering and inquired whether the Vael would be willing to share their methodology, or, in the alternative, permit a research team to study the resulting sphere from close range, as it presented a unique opportunity to study the macroscopic effects of gravitational compression in a natural vacuum environment. Dr. Hoffman attached, as a gesture of goodwill, 3 of his papers on related theoretical applications and hoped the Vael would find them interesting. Arafal read the message twice. He looked at the compressed moon. He looked at the message. He had used this demonstration 47 times. 47 times it had led to worship, submission, or the kind of scared, frozen silence that preceded both. Never had it led to academic correspondence. On the bridge's secondary deck of the Unconquerable Union, Ensign Adeyemi opened the full record of the day's events before ending his shift. He read the Sims form. He read Dr. Hoffman's message. He read the automated acknowledgement from the HEC diplomatic registry that had assigned the Vael a case number and a preliminary classification code, and informed them that their file had been added to the contact queue. He sat with that for a while. Outside the viewport next to his post, the stars were still mostly visible. The Vael fleet was far enough away not to block the light in any meaningful way from this angle. The sky looked almost normal, almost like yesterday, when there hadn't been 47 city-sized ships at the edge of explored space. He thought about the moon. He thought about the fact that it had been compressed into an ideal sphere in just 4 minutes, and that humanity's reaction to this had been to ask for access for research. He thought about what that meant, about what kind of creature looks at something capable of crushing a moon and thinks first, "Interesting. Tell me more." He wasn't sure if he was proud of that or afraid. He looked at his hands. They were still. That was good. He was grateful for that. Somewhere above him, on the command deck, Admiral Vance was presumably doing something, reviewing data, eating another sandwich, making a series of quiet, unhurried decisions that kept the ship and its crew moving in a direction that, if they were lucky, and the calculations were good, would prove to be the right one. He trusted her. He wasn't entirely sure why he trusted her. He had known her for 11 weeks. He had spoken to her directly twice, both times for less than 3 minutes, both times on administrative and routine matters. But he had watched her those 11 weeks, as young people watch those above them, looking for what would tell them who to be, what stance to take when the universe stopped being cooperative. She was never surprised. There it is. He had watched 47 moon-crushing ships arrive at the edge of human space, and he was almost certain that somewhere on the command deck, Admiral Vance was not surprised. He didn't know if that was a good quality or a broken one. He suspected it might be both. He filed his shift-end report. He went to the mess hall for dinner. The bread was stale. He ate it anyway. On the throne of First Light, the fleet held position. The fleet had never held position before. They always moved, arrived, approached, descended into the reception of worship that followed revelation, as naturally as morning follows darkness. Holding position was not a posture for which the Dominion had a doctrine, because there had never been a need to wait. Gods never had a need to wait. Arafol stood by his window long after the cycle shift, and his attendants brought him evening food, and his room filled with soft, harmonic tones that facilitated Vaelian meditation. He stood and looked at the yellow star and felt what he called confusion. He was a precise being. He had a precise language for precise experiences. He did not tolerate imprecision in his thinking, because imprecision is how errors enter the system. And in the business of divine service, errors had consequences that rippled through civilizations. He carefully identified the components of what he was feeling. There was the obvious part, the repetitive HEC responses that followed no framework for which he had a structure. That was indeed confusing, and the confusion was real and known, and he could correctly classify it. But underneath that confusion, in a place he was carefully probing, like checking a bruise to confirm its existence, was something else, something for which his language had no word because for 4,000 years there had never been a reason to invent it. He stepped back from it. He sat. He ate his food. He listened to the harmonics. Tomorrow, he decided, he will escalate. He will send the fleet of illumination, 80 ships, a sacred military action, the highest expression of Vaelian divine authority. He had never needed them. But perhaps the minor species needed something more than a crushed moon to understand what was real, what was awe, and what was the only natural reaction to being in the presence of gods. He would give them something they could not file a research request for. He was sure of that. He was wrong about that, too. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, the fleet held position in the dark at the edge of human space, and the stars burned around them. And the ships that had never before failed to bring a species to its knees waited for a species that had answered their revelation with paperwork and academic enthusiasm, and that particular, baffling, non-medicated audacity of humans who had never in their small and fragile history learned how to be properly afraid. The gods waited. In the mess hall of the Unconquerable Union, The young ensign from Lagos ate his stale bread. The universe, as is its habit, continued on its course. The second day was quieter than the first. It stayed with Ensign Adeyemi, not the ships, not the compressed moon lying in orbit like a polished stone a god had dropped and forgotten. The silence, the way the unconquerable Union went about its business, the watch rotations, the meal cycles, the low hum of equipment checks and status reports, as if 47 ships the size of ambitions weren't sitting at the edge of explored space, waiting for humanity to fall to its knees. People ate breakfast. People argued about the temperature in the secondary crew quarters, which had been 3 degrees low for 6 weeks. Lieutenant Vasky had lost his mug again and spent 20 minutes looking for it. Eventually, he found it in the engineering bay, which made no geographical sense, and loudly blamed Petty Officer Chen, who denied everything. The argument about the mug was still going on when Adeyemi sat at his post and opened the night report. 47 contacts still stationary, the compressed moon still rotating. 3 more institutions had filed access requests for Vaelian research. 2 universities and something called the Consortium of Applied Gravitational Systems, which Adeyemi had never heard of but which apparently had strong feelings about large-scale compression events. He looked at the Vaelian fleet on his screen. He thought about the fact that they were still there, still waiting. He had grown up by the ocean. He knew, at a level of bone-deep intuition that people who grew up by large bodies of water know, that the most dangerous thing about the sea is not the storms. Storms made noise. Storms announced themselves. The dangerous thing was the calm before a change. The specific quality of water becoming flat, smooth, and ready. The Vaelian fleet possessed that quality. He entered his notes for the start of his shift and told no one, because the people around him were arguing about a coffee mug, and he didn't want to be the one to interrupt the coffee mug argument with his feelings about the water. On the morning of the 3rd day, Heck Command sent a representative, not a military one, but a diplomat, Ambassador Céline Broussard, who had spent 20 years in xenorelations and had the specific facial expression of a woman who had seen enough to be calm about most questions, but who nonetheless checked her shuttle's sensor readings with slightly more frequency than usual. Approaching the outer perimeter of the Vaelian fleet, she sent a greeting signal on the frequency the Vael used for their broadcasts. She waited. The answer came 19 seconds faster than she expected. The Vael were attentive. She noted that. The voice was not that huge voice from the broadcast. This one was modulated down, precise, clipped, still deep, still carrying that subtext that made her back teeth ache if she didn't consciously relax her jaw. You are approaching the fleet of the first created. Ambassador Céline Broussard, Diplomatic Corps, Expeditionary Human Forces. I am here to facilitate communication between the Dominion of the Vael and the HEC. I would like to request permission to board. Pause. You wish to come aboard if that is acceptable? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. You are not sending a leader. I am a leader, she said pleasantly. Diplomatic. In the HEC, diplomatic leadership handles first contact situations. Military leadership handles other situations. We try to be precise about which tools we use for which tasks. The pause this time was long enough for her to drink half her coffee. You may approach. She noted the length of the pause. She noted the tone of the last 2 words. Ungracious, unwelcoming, something like a person who had been offered a door they expected to remain closed and was now trying to figure out why it had opened. She wrote that note down. That would matter later. Broussard spent 6 hours aboard the throne of First Light. She met Arafal in a chamber that had been designed to create awe. Vaulted ceilings catching starlight through transparent panels, surfaces that seemed to breathe with a slow, bioluminescent color. Acoustics that made every sound resonate as if it were significant. She recognized the design intent, just as a carpenter recognizes joinery. Competent work, very effective work, likely on species encountering it without prior experience. She sat in the chair offered to her, a compromise furniture piece, since Vaelian physiology didn't use chairs, and they had crafted it based on their assumptions of what a human chair should be. It was a little too high and a little too hard and angled in such a way that it caused her slight physical discomfort, which she suspected was not accidental. She said nothing about the chair. Arafol spoke of the Dominion. He spoke of the 11 species in it, their prosperity, their peace, their elevation from confusion to purpose. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had delivered the same speech many times and believed in it completely, which seemed more interesting to her than if he had been cynical. Cynicism was easy. True belief was different. She listened. She asked questions cautious, expressing curiosity rather than challenge. She asked about the 11 species. She asked what their lives looked like before and after joining the Dominion. She asked about trade, resource distribution, management structure. Arafol answered. He was, she noted, genuinely proud. Not performative pride, but actually proud, as a builder is proud of something he had built with his own hands over a very long time. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "The HEC values information. We will need time for review and internal consultations before further discussions." Arafol looked at her with all 4 eyes. "How much time?" he asked. She pondered. 60 days would be a reasonable starting point. The chamber was very quiet. 60 days, he repeated. Plus or minus. These decisions involve many stakeholders on our side. Democracy is thorough, if not always fast. She said it without irony. It was the part that remained for Arafol. After that, she said it as a simple fact, as one reports the weather. She thanked him for his hospitality. She rose from the slightly incorrect chair without visible discomfort. She shook, or rather, tried to mimic a handshake, considering the differences in limb configuration his central hand, which surprised him greatly, as no representative of the lower species had ever initiated physical contact with a high follower. She left. Arafol stood in the chamber for a long time after her shuttle left the perimeter. 60 days. They wanted 60 days. He had delivered the revelation 11 times. The average transition from submission to worship took 4 days. The longest had been the Terrats, a stubborn and geologically minded species, and they had taken 19 days. 60. He walked to the window and looked at the yellow star and again identified what lay beneath the confusion. The Nameless. He pressed on it, then stepped back before getting too close to knowing what it was. He summoned his generals. It is time, he decided, to demonstrate that which could neither be classified, nor studied, nor given a 60-day review period. The demonstration occurred at 14 station time on the 4th day. The Vael lined up 3 of their larger ships in a triangular formation about 2 million kilometers from the nearest HEC-inhabited colony, Station Porok, a mid-sized orbital platform where about 40 people lived. They didn't approach the station. They positioned themselves so that the station's population could see them with the naked eye from the observation decks. Then the 3 ships activated their surface illumination arrays. They glowed not in the way a building is lit, but in the way a star shines, pouring light outward in directed columns, visible for millions of kilometers, slowly shifting through frequencies from infrared through the visible spectrum into ultraviolet. The pattern was not random. The light spelled words, the same words as always, the same words that 11 times before had preceded the moment when a species understood that there was something in the universe so much greater than itself that resistance simply was not a category worth considering. On Station Porok, 400 people went to their observation decks. They watched. The light was truly extraordinary. Objective observer reports would later describe it as the cleanest, most beautiful thing they had ever seen, something that made the human visual system feel inadequate and overwhelmed and grateful for the overwhelm. People cried. Several of them stood on the observation decks in the soft light of the 3 mountain-sized ships. People cried because beautiful things sometimes make people cry, and this was, whatever else it might be, beautiful. Then someone in the crowd on the observation deck said loudly, "Is this a coordinated light show?" And someone else said, "I think it's writing something." And a third person took out a translation app and said, "It says they're gods." And the crowd went silent for a moment, and then someone laughed. Not an evil laugh, not a mocking one. The specific laugh of a human who had just processed something their brains struggled to fit into a normal category. The laughter spread, not because it was funny per se, but because laughter is what humans do when they look at something huge and incomprehensible, and their body needs to do something that is not screaming. Within an hour, someone had posted a clip from the observation deck. Within 3 hours, it had more views than anything else on the HEC media network. Within 6 hours, the comments were mostly jokes. The press conference was not the HEC's idea. Command wanted a visible, calm, senior military representative in public communication. The public was doing what the public does when something large and inexplicable appears on their doorstep, cycling between fascination and light fear, and that particular human mechanism of deflecting both with humor. Command wanted someone solid and trustworthy in front of the camera. They called Vance. She accepted it as she accepted everything, with a single sound that conveyed acknowledgement without enthusiasm. The press conference took place aboard the Union in a conference room with the HEC flag behind her and a table in front of her. A dozen journalists were positioned in a semicircle with the polite, predatory energy of journalists who know they are covering something significant and want their moment of it. She sat down. She poured water from the pitcher on the table. She looked at the journalists with a gaze that 31 years of command gives a person, a gaze that is neither aggressive nor warm, but completely and exhaustingly unimpressed. The questions rained down. She answered them. Troop movements were not discussed. Civilian evacuation protocols were under review. Details would follow. Heck's diplomatic position, Broussard's team was handling that, working well. Then a journalist from the independent network of the Sol system, young, ambitious, slightly flushed with the importance of the moment, leaned forward and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Admiral, do you personally believe the Vael statement? Do you think they really might be gods? The room went quiet. Vance looked at him. She picked up her water glass. She drank. She set it down. I believe, she said, that they have large ships and a marketing problem. The room was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then it stopped being silent. Adeyemi watched the clip 4 times. He watched it the first time on his personal terminal during a break because it was in his news feed, and he clicked without thinking. He watched it a second time because he wanted to make sure he heard correctly. He watched a third time to study Vance's face, its specific flatness, the complete lack of performance in it, the way she spoke the words, the way a person asserts something that has been true for a long time and isn't worth dramatizing. He watched a 4th time because he couldn't stop. Large ships and a marketing problem. 47 ships, each larger than anything humanity had ever built. A compressed moon, a light show, 6 hours of coordinated illumination designed by beings who had been doing this for 4,000 years, honed through 11 species-level conversions, optimized for the specific visual and psychological architecture of creatures who feared the dark. And Vance called it a marketing problem. The clip reached 30 million views before the start of his shift. By the time his shift ended, it had reached 200 million. By the next morning, it had been translated into 67 languages, including 3 dialects of Vaelian, by Vaelian xenolinguists who had been working around the clock since the fleet arrived. Adeyemi sat at his post and watched the view counter and felt something for which he had no complete name, something that was not quite pride and not quite fear, and sat exactly between them like a knife blade between the things on either side of it. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of species that looks at something that had crushed a moon and asks for research access, that looks at a divine light show and makes jokes, whose admiral, when asked if she believed in gods, says marketing problem and means it the way she means everything, completely, without performance, as a simple statement of what is real. He thought about what this would look like from the outside, from the Vaelian side. 4,000 years, 11 species, a formula that had never failed. And then this collection of organisms that should have been terrified and instead did what? Laughed, filed paperwork, ate stale bread, argued about coffee mugs, asked for 60 days for internal review. He thought about the Vaelian fleet out there in the dark, 47 ships holding position, waiting for the answer that the biology of all previous species made inevitable, and receiving instead a press conference clip that was approaching 300 million views, and a comment section full of jokes about divine marketing budgets. He sat with it all. Then he went back to monitoring, because his monitoring work needed to be done. A reconnaissance ship left the Vaelian fleet at 2:00. It wasn't a combat ship. It was mid-sized large by human standards, but small in the context of the Vaelian fleet, the type of ship used for close-range reconnaissance. It crossed the designated contact border between the fleet's position and Heck-explored space, which had been established by Heck Border Protocol and communicated to the Vael in their initial SIMS documentation. The Union registered it at 2:13. Adeyemi, on the early shift, noted it at 2:14. Vance was notified at 2:15. At 2:16, the response was transmitted to the Vaelian fleet. An official notification that the ship had crossed the contact border without permission and was requested to return to its previous position. The reconnaissance ship did not return. It continued to move. At 2:31, the Union's long-range sensors registered the reconnaissance ship's position 170 kilometers inside the contact border. At 2:32, the sensors registered nothing. The ship had vanished. Not destroyed, no energy signature consistent with weapons, no debris field, no radiation flare. It vanished as things vanish when they are no longer where they were, without any of the expected evidence of how it happened. Adeyemi stared at the empty space on his screen where the contact had been. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't ask what had happened to it. He was 23, 11 weeks into service, and he had learned things that junior officers didn't ask about on open channels, because the question was less important than the knowledge, which was that something had happened, something intentional and clean and completely unannounced, and that whoever had orchestrated it didn't feel the need to explain themselves. He entered the loss of contact into the log in accordance with standard protocol. He moved on. On the throne of First Light, the report on the reconnaissance ship's disappearance arrived on Arafal's desk at 3. He read it 3 times. Not because it was complex, but because it took him 3 readings to accept that it said what it said. The ship had vanished without a fight. No warning, no debris, no communication with the crew. Simply disappeared, removed from existence as cleanly as if someone had reached into space and closed their hand around it. He summoned his generals. They argued for an immediate retaliatory measure. A strike on Station Porok, the inhabited platform near which the 3 illumination installations were located. It would be noticeable. It would be final. It would demonstrate definitively that there was no version of this interaction where humanity's minor gestures of defiance went unanswered. Arafal refused. He refused not because he was merciful. You do not break that which you have come to elevate. You do not harm that which you have come to save. The moment you harm them, you cease to be a god and become a conqueror. And that was not the same thing. And the difference mattered a great deal. And he had spent 70 years holding to that line, because truth lived on the line. But the reconnaissance ship had vanished. 23 crew members had vanished. He stood by the window and looked at the yellow star and thought about what kind of species gets a divine light show, watches it with visible tears, and then quietly removes a reconnaissance ship from existence without comment or explanation. The nameless under the confusion was rising. He stepped back from it. He thought about the 11 species, about the Terrats, the patient, stony Terrats, who had held out for 19 days and then come to the revelation with a sincerity that genuinely touched him. He thought about the worship that followed, about the genuine comfort the Dominion gave to creatures who were afraid and alone in the dark. He thought about why the formula worked, because it was true. It was true. It had to be true. He straightened all 3 arms. He looked at his generals. "Deploy the fleet of illumination," he said. The generals went silent for a moment, because the fleet of illumination was not something one deployed casually. It was not a weapon in the ordinary sense. It was a statement, the largest possible statement, written by 80 ships and several thousand years of continuous divine authority. It had never been deployed. It had never needed to be. "All 80 ships, High Follower?" his chief general asked. "All 80. He said it as one says things one is certain of, as one says things that have never been untrue. Adeyemi was not on shift when the news came down. The Vael were moving additional ships into the contact zone. Not 47, but 80 more. In addition to the existing 47, he was in the mess hall, eating dinner. The bread was still stale. He read the alert on his personal terminal, then placed the terminal face down on the table. He finished his dinner. He thought about the water near Lagos, about how it became flat and smooth before a change. He thought about his sister at home, who was 12 years old and wanted to be a xenobiologist. He thought about the letter he was supposed to write her, which he had been putting off because he didn't know what to say that would be honest but not terrifying. He thought about Vance, about the press conference clip, about the specific quality of a person who wasn't surprised. He picked up his bread. He finished it. He decided he would write the letter tomorrow. He didn't know yet what would be in it, but tomorrow seemed like a reasonable place to start. He went to sleep. 127 ships held position at the edge of human space. Humanity's reaction across all public communication channels remained jokes. No one on the Union slept particularly well. No one said it out loud. They were that kind of crew. The fleet of illumination arrived as a closing door arrives, all at once. No phased entry, No neat formation construction over 20 minutes of sensor contact. 80 ships simultaneously exited FTL transition in a ring formation that surrounded the existing 47, like a fist clenching something small. The cumulative sensor readings at all HEC border stations and deep monitoring platforms registered the event as a single, catastrophic spike. 3 stations went offline briefly because their systems were not built for such a rapid and high count. 127 ships. The number sat in Adeyemi's field of vision like something with too many facets to look at directly. He was on shift when they arrived. He saw it on his screen in real time. Contacts bloomed like something incorrectly flowering. Each huge, each adding its mass to the collective weight that his screen displayed in a shade of red his screen hadn't used before. He said nothing. The bridge around him was silent. The silence was the kind that occurs when a room full of people simultaneously makes the same calculations and gets the same answer. And the answer is something you don't say out loud. He looked at his screen. He looked at the marker for one human contact. He looked at the 127 contacts surrounding it. He picked up his water, he drank, he set it down. He went back to monitoring work. It was the only thing he could think of to do. Vance was on the command deck when the fleet arrived. She looked at the main screen, a 2-meter full display showing surrounding space within a 4 million kilometer radius. She saw the appearance of 80 new contacts. She saw the formation closing. She stood with coffee in hand, weight on her back foot, looking at the screen as she looked at everything. Like a doctor looking at an X-ray, reading it, not reacting to it. Her first officer, Commander Ibar, 15 years of service, a compact and precise officer who didn't fidget. He wasn't fidgeting, but his jaw was clenched as it hadn't been an hour ago. "Admiral," he said, "recommended action." She looked at the screen. She looked at the formation. She looked at the geometry of 127 ships arranged in a formation that, from certain angles, resembled a hand preparing to close. She thought about the thing she had decided 3 months ago in a room at HEC Command, with 6 other people who had the same clearance level and the same tired eyes and the same understanding of what was likely coming. She thought about what had been agreed upon in that room and what had been positioned, where and why, and at what cost, and how long it had been lying there, waiting. "Hold position," she said. Ibar looked at her. "Hold? Hold," she repeated. He nodded. He went back to his post. He held. Vance drank her coffee. Arafol looked at the screen. 1 ship. He checked it 3 times, because once was not enough for something so incredible, and twice was still not enough. 3 times. His sensor team confirmed it 3 times. There was 1 human ship, the same mid-class ship that had been registered in the contact zone from the first day. The Unconquerable Union, HEC Registry MCV, 7741, standing alone in the center of the Illumination Fleet formation. Not retreating, not challenging, not doing anything at all, just standing there, 1 ship. His chief general, standing to his left, said what everyone was thinking. "They aren't moving." "I see that. It's an insult," the general said. "Deliberate. They want us to see that they aren't afraid." Arafol looked at the 1 ship on his screen. He thought about the documents, the research requests, the press conference clip his intelligence officers had translated and shown him, and which had triggered in his chest the first real flare of something sharp and hot he had experienced in a very long time. The ambassador with the incorrect chair, 60 days, 1 ship. He thought about what that meant, not tactically. The tactical calculation was simple and required no time at all. What did it mean underneath the tactics? What did it say about the creatures inside it? He had spent his career reading species, reading how they moved, what they built, and how they organized their fear. Because all species organize their fear into structures, into gods, or governments, or armies, or histories. If you understand the structure of a species' fear, you understand everything about them. He looked at the 1 ship. He tried to understand the structure of their fear. He couldn't find it. "Prepare the weapons array," he said. "All arrays, High Follower?" He looked at the 1 ship. "Yes," he said. "Let's end this." The channel opened not from the HEC side, but from the Vael. A direct challenge on the Union's command frequency. Precise and clean, no interference, no limbic response modulation, just an open, waiting signal. Vance set down her coffee. She accepted the call. Arafol's voice sounded from the bridge speakers. Not the broadcasting voice, not the huge one, but the real one, the one he used in the chambers. When the performance was over and a real conversation needed to be had, it was still deep, it still had weight, but it was a voice, just a voice, and Vance listened to it as she listened to all voices. He said, "You have one ship." "Yes," she said. "You understand what you are facing?" "Yes." Pause. "Then you understand," he said, "that what you are doing is not courage, it is something else. I would like to understand what that is." Vance paused. Not the silence of a person looking for words, but the silence of a person deciding which truth to tell out of several available. "Arafal," she said. "This is Admiral Saravens, HEC Unconquerable Union. We have reviewed your revelation. Our response is, no. You have one opportunity to deploy your fleet. After that, we will begin." Silence from both sides of the channel. On the bridge of the Union, no one breathed. In the Vaelian command chamber, no one moved. The channel was still open. Both sides could hear the background sounds of each other's ships, the low mechanical breathing of systems, the distant structural creaks of large vessels holding position in the cold. Then Arafal said very quietly, so quietly the translation software barely caught it, something that in the Vaelian language had no clean equivalent in the human language. The closest translation was, "So that is what it sounds like." Then the channel closed. Then the Vael fired. It was not one weapon. It was not a warning shot. Not a targeted strike, not that weighed application of force that leaves room for interpretation. It was a full, simultaneous discharge of 127 warships, firing all the weapons systems they had at one target. On the sensor logs viewed later, it looked like the birth of a small star. The light was visible from Station Porok with the naked eye. The shock wave from the cumulative energy output registered on seismic monitors on the third planet in the system. In the center, where the Unconquerable Union had been, where the screen said it still was, where all targeting calculations confirmed the strike had landed, there was fire. A great deal of fire. Adeyemi looked at it on his screen and stopped breathing. The fire expanded outward. Sensors reported energy readings that were objectively incompatible with the survival of any vessel built by humans. Then the fire dissipated. The Union's contact marker was still on the screen. A scorched hull, one engine signature reduced to 15%. Side shielding compromised on the port side. A list of secondary system failures scrolled down the damage report that Adeyemi was loading, because his hands needed something to do. Still there. One ship was still there. Adeyemi realized he was gripping his console with both hands so hard his fingers ached. He realized his mouth was open. He closed it. He looked at the contact marker. He looked at the damage report. He thought about how the answer to the question how had begun 3 months ago in an HEC command room with 6 people who all understood that a species declaring itself gods on multiple frequencies was unlikely to accept a polite refusal. The Union hadn't arrived in the contact zone alone. It had arrived first, visibly, loudly, with its transponder broadcasting on all channels. One ship, exactly as advertised. What it had also done over the next 3 months was serve as a focus for the Vaelian fleet, whose own sensor arrays were, by design, focused forward and outward, looking for threats, looking for incoming ships, looking at the one human ship incredibly sitting in the middle of it all, not looking backward, not looking at the dead space in the sensor shadow created by the Vaelian fleet's own formation. The geometry of 127 large vessels created shadow zones, and shadow zones, if you knew where they would be before the fleet arrived, could be used. 41 human ships had been in position for 9 weeks, non-worshipping, smaller, faster, carrying a cumulative strike package that 11 engineers and a team from the Theoretical Weapons Application Department had been developing for 18 months around one specific question. What does a species with 4,000 years of weapons technology not know how to defend against? The answer, after 18 months, was angles. The Vaelian defense systems were built for direct confrontation, for threats that announced themselves, that came in formation, that behaved as a military force behaves when it is confident in its power. They were not built for 40 small ships firing from inside the formation, from shadow zones where there should have been nothing, from angles to which the defensive arrays were not oriented because those angles were considered safe. The Vael fired everything they had. The Union absorbed it behind shielding that had been specially re-engineered for this moment, behind a hull that had been reinforced to an absurd degree, behind the understanding that the ship didn't need to win the exchange, it just needed to last long enough. 8 minutes. That was the number. 8 minutes from the first Vaelian weapons discharge to the full execution of the strike package. The Union needed to last 8 minutes. It lasted 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The first strike hit the Vaelian fleet from a direction their sensors classified as empty. Then the second, then 7 simultaneously. Then an escalating cascade of strikes that moved through the illumination fleet like a hand sliding across a keyboard, methodical, intentional, one after another, one after another. Not every Vaelian ship was destroyed. That was not the goal. The goal was specific systems, weapons arrays, nuclear reactors, FTL capabilities. The strike package was designed not for killing, but for stopping, for eliminating the capability for movement and the capability for firing. To leave the crews alive and the ships intact but frozen, drifting, unable to do anything but watch. The Vaelian return fire was immediate and disorganized. Disorganized because the attacks were coming from inside their formation, from positions that should have been impossible. And disorganized fire from ships that can't find a target is noise, not a threat. On the bridge of the Union, 8 minutes looked like this. Adeyemi, with both hands on the console, watching the scrolling damage reports and the Vaelian weapons tracing on his screen, and the 41 friendly contacts blooming from the shadow zones, watching the execution of the strike package. Contact by contact down the list like items checked off a shopping list. This one done, this one done, this one done. Vance, standing, not sitting, which was the only visible sign that this moment differed from all others. Her coffee sat on the console beside her. She didn't touch it. The hull screamed twice, not a moan, but an actual scream. The sound of a large metal structure pushed past comfortable limits by energy discharges that would have killed anything with a thinner shell. The port lights went out for 4 seconds and came back on. Vasky's coffee mug, the one he had found in the engineering bay, slid off the edge of the console and shattered on the floor. And someone, somewhere on the bridge, made a sound that was almost a laugh, high and involuntary, and immediately swallowed it. 8 minutes, 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Then Ibar said from his station, very calmly, "Strike package fully executed. Admiral. Confirmed loss of contact on 6-3 Vaelian ships. 18 confirmed mobility shutdowns. 12 remaining contacts show full combat readiness." Vance picked up her coffee. She drank. She set it down. She opened the channel. Arafol was still standing when the channel opened. He hadn't sat down for 8 minutes. He had stood and watched his fleet, his illumination fleet, his sacredly created weapon, the statement that had never needed to be made because no species had ever demanded it falling to pieces, as his mind couldn't fully process it in real time. Not destroyed all at once, but piece by piece, contact by contact, methodically from inside his own formation, from angles for which his defensive doctrine had no category, with weapons he hadn't detected and couldn't target. His generals were speaking, all of them. Loud, overlapping voices, calculating, recalculating, finding no calculation that made sense for what had just happened. He heard none of it. He looked at his screen. 63 ships gone. 1 human ship, scorched, slightly listing. 1 engine compromised, still on the screen, still there. The channel opened. The voice that came through was not raised. It was not triumphant. It was the same voice as before. The level, slightly dry voice of a person asserting a thing that had long been true. Vance said, "Your move." The bridge of the throne of First Light was absolutely silent. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people watching as the man they had followed for 70 years realizes something for which none of them has words. Arafol looked at the screen. He looked at the one ship. He looked at his own hands, all 3, and noticed that his bioluminescence had shifted, not intentionally. His skin had been shimmering with the usual gold and cathedral blue hues for most of the engagement. And now it had shifted to something he could not name, a color that was not in the Vaelian palette for conscious states. It was the color of involuntary things. He stood with it. He looked at the screen. He thought about 4,000 years. He thought about the 11 species. He thought about the formula, the one that was true, the one that had always been true. The one he had carried his whole life like one carries something precious that had never been dropped. He thought about the one ship. He had no structure. That was the point. Not a tactical loss. Losses could be processed, studied, learned from. What he had no structure for was simpler. He looked into the structure of their fear. He found nothing. Not because they were fearless. He understood enough from the intercepted messages. The ambassador's body language, the handling traces that the sensor data had shown him in the Union's own logs. They were afraid. The young ensign on the secondary deck, the first officer with the clenched jaw, perhaps even the admiral herself. In ways that didn't reach the surface, they were afraid, and they did it anyway. And that was what his language could not describe, because in 4,000 years of service, no species had ever been afraid and still said, no, not one. He stood by his screen and looked at the one ship and felt the nameless under the confusion and let it come. This time, completely to the surface. He gave it a name. He had been right about what it was. He sat down for the first time in 8 minutes. He sat down heavily, the way something sits that had been holding a weight it didn't know it was holding, and the weight had suddenly vanished. He looked at his generals, all of whom were waiting, all of whom were looking at him as they always looked at him in expectation of the next word, the next direction, the shape of what would follow. He said nothing for a long time. Then, do not answer with fire. High follower, do not answer with fire? Do not answer with fire. They went silent. Outside, 12 ships of the illumination fleet held position in the dark. Around them, debris and drifting parts and silence. 63 ships that had never before been needed until today. The Union held its position. The channel was still open. Adeyemi sat at his post, hands on his lap. The bridge had been silent since the last report. Vance. A non-arithmetic silence, like before. Something else. Something that was trying to understand what shape it had, what category it belonged to, what the right answer to the last 8 minutes and 40 seconds was. He looked at his screen. He looked at the damage report that was still scrolling. He thought about the small ship that had sat in the dark for 9 weeks waiting. He thought about the people on those ships, the crews who had been in the sensor shadow for 9 weeks, eating what their small galleys could allow, sleeping in turns, silent on any frequency because silence was the entire weapon. Silence and patience and angles. 9 weeks. He thought about what kind of species plans that. He thought about what kind of species looks at 127 divine ships and thinks, we need to be clever. He thought about his mother in Lagos, about his sister who wanted to be a xenobiologist. He thought about the letter he still hadn't written. Across the screen, the 12 remaining Vaelian contacts held position, not advancing, not retreating, sitting the way something sits when it is deciding what it is now. Vance was still standing. Her coffee was cold. She didn't notice. The hull was still radiating heat from the port-side impacts. Adeyemi felt it faintly through the panel of his post heat that was not comfortable but was real, present, a physical record of what had just happened, stamped into the ship's plating. He put his hands back on the console. He went back to monitoring. His hands were steady. He noticed that. He held onto it the way one holds small good things when big things are still unresolved. The screen showed one human ship, scorched, slightly listing to the left. One engine operating at 15%. Still there. His ship was still there. The 12 remaining ships did not move for 9 hours. They sat in a formation tighter than before, instinctive, the way creatures huddle together when the boogeyman has proven worth fearing. The debris of the illumination fleet drifted around them in pieces that the Union sensors catalogued without comment. 63 ships had been brought into various states of silence. 18 more were under power but could not move. Their drive systems had been gutted with surgical precision by the strike package. Their crews were alive and presumably sitting in the same silence as their commanders. The Union held its position. Vance let them sit. Ibar asked twice if they should advance, exploit the advantage, turn the remaining 12 into the same immobility as the rest, complete the operation. Twice Vance said no. She said it without clarification, without explanation, as she said most things as a complete sentence that didn't require the support of additional sentences. Adeyemi, watching from his post, thought he understood. You don't hit a downed opponent not out of mercy, although mercy was part of it, because the sitting was the point. Because the 12 ships remaining there with cold engines, silent weapons, looking at what remained of 80 ships that had never before been needed until today, that was a lesson being learned in real time, and interrupting the lesson before it was finished was a waste. He wasn't sure if Vance actually thought that. He thought it was possible. He went back to his screen and watched the 12 contacts and waited, as the ship waited, and tried not to think too much about his hands, which were steady, for which he was grateful every time he noticed it. Arafal requested a link after 14 hours, not a broadcast, a direct channel, ship to ship, command to command, a frequency that meant, this is not a performance. This is two people who need to say something to each other without an audience. Vance accepted. He spoke without preamble. He offered what he had to offer. The accumulated resources of the Dominion were significant, catalogued over 4,000 years and 11 species worth. He offered technology, gravitational compression, improvements to FTL travel that human engineers had not yet reached, medical knowledge from 11 biological traditions, some of which dealt with conditions that HEC medicine was still treating with hope and guesswork. He offered an elevated status in the Dominion, a seat in the governing body, a voice in how the collective was run. He offered all of this in the even tone of a man who knows he is offering the wrong thing, but hasn't yet learned what the right thing would have been. Vance listened. She let him finish. Then she said, "We don't want what you're selling." Pause. "Name what you want," Arafal said. "I did not survive 70 years of service by being inflexible. Tell me what the HEC requires, and I will determine what is possible." Vance paused. Through the open channel, he heard the sounds of her ship, the structural sounds of a hull that had taken significant damage and was redistributing stress. The low, altered tone of the drive running at reduced power, the background hum of people continuing to work inside something that was heavily burdened. "Nothing from you," she said. "That's the point." Another pause. "I don't understand," he said. "I know." She picked up her coffee cold. She drank it anyway. That's also the point. He was silent for a long time. She let him be silent. Then he said something that surprised her, something that was not a common occurrence. He said, "What are you afraid of?" She pondered the question. "A lot of things," she said, "but not you. Not anymore. You had one move, and you made it, and now we both know what it cost." Pause. "Return home, Arafal. Take your 12 ships and go home. Tell them what happened. Tell them exactly what happened." "You are letting us leave?" "Yes. My generals will call this mercy. Your generals can call it whatever they like to help them sleep better." Another silence. "What do you call it?" he asked. Vance looked at her screen, at the 12 contacts, at the drifting field of what had been 80 ships. "Information," she said, "shared freely, without payment." She closed the channel. The 12 ships left after 3 hours. They moved slowly, not tactically, not in a controlled military retreat, but slowly, as something moves when it is unsure of the ground ahead. They left the contact zone. They cleared the debris field of their fleet, moving through it on a path that required careful maneuvering around parts of ships they knew, crews they knew. They didn't look back in any direction that sensors could measure. Adeyemi watched as they left. He watched the contact markers diminish with distance, still visible on long range, then at the edge of the range, then vanishing, absorbed by the dark as things vanish when they go far enough that instruments can no longer hold them. Gone. He sat for a moment with the emptiness on his screen. Then the alarm started. The first anomaly came from space controlled by the Vael, a system called Veteruna. Home to a species the Vael called the Marats, a quiet little people, 6-limbed, photosynthesizing, who had been under the Dominion's rule for 260 years, and by all available records had been an exemplary member. Their tribute was on time. Their temple of illumination was maintained. Their designated Vaelian representative reported no problems, had never reported problems, filed the same assessment every cycle for the last 40 years. Anomaly. The tribute delivery from Veteruna was missing from the transit schedule. HEC intelligence marked it as a potential signal of something, but wasn't sure of what exactly. They noted it, moved on. The second anomaly came 6 hours later from a system 3 sectors away. A species called the Orodal, silicon-based, had been under Vaelian rule for 800 years. Their Temple of Illumination sent a maintenance request to the Vaelian administrative network. The request for regular maintenance of the temple required the replacement of the central illumination array, which the Vael used for daily revelation to the population. The request specified that the replacement was needed because the current array had been dismantled by the Arats. HEC intelligence noted this louder. They called it a data point and scheduled it for analysis. Data points arrived faster after that. By the second day, there were 11. By the third day, 47. By the end of the first week, HEC intelligence stopped calling them data points and started calling them what they were, a pattern. And the pattern was this: every species currently under the rule of the Vaelian Dominion, in one form or another, to one degree or another, proportional to their resources and circumstances, had begun to do one thing: stop. Tribute deliveries stopped first, the easiest, the most immediate, requiring the least coordination and the most courage. Simply not loading the ships, simply missing the deadline, simply sitting with the silence of what you had done for generations and choosing in this cycle not to do it. Then the temples, some dismantled, some simply closed their doors, turned off the lights. The daily revelation broadcast into empty rooms. Some remained standing but emptied of objects of worship. Sacred items returned to Vaelian administrative offices in carefully packed containers with polite notes. The Terrats, stubborn, geological Terrats, who had held out for 19 days before the revelation and who had converted with a sincerity Arafal still remembered, sent their note in a container with 11 smaller containers nested inside, one for each sacred item they had held for 600 years. The note said, "We have considered recent events. We believe we require more time." Hek Intelligence called Commander Ebar to a briefing to report on the pattern. Ebar looked at the map, every system controlled by the Dominion marked with a sequence of their stated changes, and went silent for a moment. "All of them?" he asked. "All of them," the intelligence officer said. "In various stages, some faster, some slower, but all of them are moving." Ebar looked at the map. He thought about the one ship, about the 8 minutes, about the 41 smaller ships sitting in the dark for 9 weeks. He thought about the Vaelian fleet of 47 ships created for Revelation, and the Illumination fleet of 80 ships created for the finale, and about how neither of them had won. He thought about what Vance had said when he asked why she let the remaining 12 ships go. Information, shared freely, without payment. "The 12 ships that left," he said. "They passed through the Dominion's space." "Yes," said the officer. "They passed through those systems." "Yes." Ebar looked at the map. "They saw it as it was happening?" he said. "In real time? As they traveled, they watched their own empire?" "Yes," the officer said. He didn't finish the sentence. The Urats broadcast arrived on the 15th day. The Urats were not a prominent species. They were small, a population of about 12 million on one moon, orbiting a gas giant on the outer edge. They had been under Vaelian rule for 600 years. They had no army, no space technology of their own, no resources of any particular value. They had, by all external measures, the least reason to move first and the most reason to remain stationary and wait to see what the big species would do. The broadcast came over the Vael's own sacred frequency, the one reserved exclusively for divine Vaelian transmissions, the sacred channel that only the Vael used, which no species in 11 years had ever dared to touch. The broadcast consisted of one word: in Vael. No, that was it. One word on the sacred frequency from a species of 12 million on one moon. 600 years of their submission. HEC Intelligence received it. They decoded it. They sat with it. Then one of the analysts, a young woman named Park, who had spent 12 hours straight on interception and was perhaps a bit beyond professional detachment, read the translation and quietly let the room know, as one reads what deserves to be heard. No. The room went quiet. Then Park said, not addressing anyone in particular, 12 million people, no warships, 600 years. No one added anything to that. Adeyemi worked overtime, not by order, by his own choice, or what passed for choice when you're 23, and the most significant event in living history was happening on your screen, and ending his shift felt like a betrayal. He slept in 4-hour blocks. He ate at his post. He watched the pattern build across the Dominion's territory like something catching the light. One system, then another, then 3 more, then a cascade. He thought about fire, about how fire moves not because every burning object decided to burn, but because heat is transferred, because the conditions for burning spread upon contact, because one ignition point, if it burns hot enough and long enough, changes the conditions for everything around it. He thought about the one ship. He thought about what it did and what it didn't do. It hadn't freed anyone, hadn't swept through the Dominion's space with burning weapons, breaking chains, delivering freedom in the military sense, usually implied by histories. When they used the word liberation, it did one thing. It held for 8 minutes and 40 seconds against 127 ships and stayed on the screen after that. It showed 12 million Urats on one moon and 600 years of Terrats, and 800 years of Arats, and 260 years of Mirats, and every other species that had ever felt the Vaelian purity shake their bones and back teeth. It showed all of them what a thing looks like when it is not certainly, not easily, not without cost possible. That was all it showed them. That was enough. He was writing a letter to his sister. He was writing it in pieces between monitoring checks. A paragraph here, 3 sentences there. Building it the way you build something when you don't yet know what it will look like when finished, but you know it needs to be built. He hadn't yet found the right words for the main thing, for what he wanted to say. He kept walking around it. He wrote about the bread. He wrote about Vasky's coffee mug. He wrote about the screen and how it looked when 127 contact markers became 1-2 and how the 12 looked when they turned and left. He wrote, "It keeps occurring to me why we laughed." He wrote, "Not because we weren't afraid. We were afraid everyone on this ship was afraid. And I think the Admiral was afraid too, somewhere where she holds that. But we still laughed at the light show, at the press conference, at all of it. And I think there's something in that I don't quite understand yet." He stopped. He read what he had written. He added, "I think maybe it's related to something that cannot be taken from someone who doesn't believe it belongs to you." He saved the letter. He went back to his screen. On the 21st day, Arafal addressed the Dominion Council. It was not a public address. In the chamber were 31 members of the council, representatives of the Vael's internal governing body, the people who had run the practical reality of the divine empire for 300 years, while the high followers managed its theology. He stood before them. He had prepared nothing. He told them what had happened. Exactly. Everything. From the Sims form to the press conference clip, to Broussard's visit, to the compressed moon, to the 8 minutes and 40 seconds, to the 12 ships that turned and left through an empire that, by the time they returned home, was not quite the empire they had left. He told it simply, without framing, without context intended to soften or explain or make it anything other than what it was. The council went silent when he finished. The senior member of the council, older even than Arafal's senior one who had served before the start of his ministry, said, "What actions do you recommend we take?" Arafal looked at the council. He looked at 31 faces that were shimmering with the same colors his face had shimmered with when he sat in the command chair after Vance's last message. The gold and cathedral blue colors had become strange, an involuntary palette. "We must understand," he said. "We spent 4,000 years mistaking submission for validation." The chamber was very quiet. "Submission," he said again, "is not faith, not a true recognition of who we are. Submission is produced by fear, by awe, by a demonstration of power so complete that refusal seemed not just dangerous, but literally unimaginable." He paused. "Humans made it imaginable. That is what they did. That is the only thing they did, and it was enough." The elder to his left said, "Are you saying the revelation is false?" Arafal looked at him. He thought about the answer to that question. He had thought about it since the 14th hour, when the 12 ships turned to leave and he watched the contact markers diminish, and felt what he finally named, settling in him forever. "I am saying," he said cautiously, "that a truth that requires fear for survival is not the truth I thought we had." No one answered. The chamber held the silence the way chambers hold things that are too big and too dense to be moved immediately, the way they absorb and wait and allow time to do what an argument cannot. He did not stay for the ensuing debate. He went to his rooms. He stood by the window. The view from this window differed from the throne of first light. A courtyard, a pale sky, the ordinary light of a home star that had burned before the existence of his faith and would burn long after what followed. He looked at his hands. He thought about the 11 species. He thought about the Terrets, the sincere, stony, truly converted Terrets, and wondered what they were thinking tonight. Was what they felt in the revelation real, even if the frame around it was wrong? Did meaning and truth mean the same thing, or could they be separated, and what remained if they were? He stood by the window for a long time. He didn't arrive at conclusions. He suspected that was appropriate. On the Union, Vance signed the after-action report. It was long. After-action reports of this scale were always long. System log pages, damage assessments, weapons deployment authorizations, communication transcripts, execution records of the strike package, casualty reports. No casualties. Heck, that was the line she read twice. She read it in the preliminary version, in the final version, and she read it as she read everything, directly, without expression. Then she set the report aside and for a moment sat at her desk, as she almost never sat, doing nothing, not reading, not reviewing a non-productive stillness of a person whose mind is working on the next task, simply sitting. She thought about the ship she had commanded 22 years ago, a smaller ship, a crew of 91, by a species that had also announced itself with majesty, with overwhelming force, with the absolute certainty of things that had never lost. She thought about the 43 names she still remembered in order. She looked at the after-action report. No casualties, HEC. She picked up the report. She signed it. She placed it in the outgoing stack. She went for coffee. Adeyemi finished the letter on the 23rd day. It was longer than he had intended. It covered things he hadn't planned to cover: the bread, the mug, the screen. 8 minutes. The Urats and their one word on the sacred frequency. The pattern spreading through the dominion like something catching the light. The last paragraph took him the longest. He wrote, "I don't know what happens next. I think nobody knows. The Vael still exist. Their ships are still there. The 11 species are in the middle of something they have never done before. And they will need from us and from themselves something that no one has yet figured out how to provide. The galaxy looks different than it did a month ago. And I am not sure we have the right words for how it looks now." He wrote, "But it keeps occurring to me, why did we laugh?" He wrote, "Not because we weren't afraid. We were afraid everyone on this ship was afraid. And I think the Admiral was afraid too, somewhere where she holds that. But we still laughed at the light show, at the press conference, at all of it. And I think there's something in that I don't quite understand yet." He stopped. He read what he had written. He added, "I think maybe it's related to something that cannot be taken from someone who doesn't believe it belongs to you." He saved the letter. He went back to his screen. On the 23rd day, Adeyemi finished the letter. It was longer than he had intended. It covered things he hadn't planned to cover: the bread, the mug, and the screen. 8 minutes. The Urats, and their one word on the sacred frequency, the pattern spreading through the dominion like something catching the light. The last paragraph took him the longest. He wrote, "I don't know what happens next. I think nobody knows. The Vael still exist. Their ships are still there. The 11 species are in the middle of something they have never done before, and they will need from us and from themselves something that no one has yet figured out how to provide. The galaxy looks different than it did a month ago, and I am not sure we have the right words for how it looks now." He wrote, "But it keeps occurring to me, why did we laugh?" He wrote, "Not because we weren't afraid, we were afraid. Everyone on this ship was afraid, and I think the Admiral was afraid too, somewhere where she holds that. But we still laughed at the light show, at the press conference, at all of it. And I think there's something in that I don't quite understand yet." He stopped. He read what he had written. He added, "I think maybe it's related to something that cannot be taken from someone who doesn't believe it belongs to you." He saved the letter. He went back to his screen. "I think that's the whole story. I think everything else, the ship, the battle, the 8 minutes, it's just us showing them that this word exists, that this is a real word, that such words have weight when you use them, and that the weight is survivable." He stopped. He added at the very end, "Be curious about the aliens, Amara, but don't be afraid of them. The ones worth understanding are the ones trying to understand us in return. The ones that aren't, we've dealt with worse." He sent the letter. He went back to his screen. The contact zone was quiet. The debris field was being catalogued by the salvage team. 12 ships were somewhere in Dominion space, traveling home through an empire that was deciding, system by system, in its own time and in its own way, what it would be now. The Union held its position scorched, slightly listing, one engine at 15%, and holding, still there. The stars burned around it as they had always burned, steadily, indifferently, older than every story ever told about them by every species that had ever looked up and felt that particular human horror of the dark and that particular human need to put something in it, something huge, knowing, and constant something that would look back. The stars didn't look back, they simply burned. And in the light they gave off, one battered ship sat in the silence of the contact zone, which was no longer the epicenter but not yet the resolution, in the long, complex, intermediate space between what had been and what was next, and waited as people wait, with cooling coffee, with stale bread, with written and sent letters and a screen to monitor and work that needed to be done in the steady, unremarkable, unconquerable habit of continuing, always this continuing. They claimed they were gods until a human battleship destroyed everything they believed in.